value is because of the traditions, the mindsets, the ideology still exists. They may put on different clothes or may not necessarily wear the white wig that you see featured here, but some of these mentalities are still here. And this is what we interface with, not only on one side, but on both sides. And so I'm going to share with you this afternoon, or whenever it is that you're watching it, some eyewitness accounts. So Mrs. Fanny Berry on Christmas, quote, slaves live just for Christmas to come around. Start getting ready the first snowfall. Commence to saving nuts and apples, fixing up party clothes, snitching lace and beans, or snitching, okay, lace and beans from the big house. General celebrating time. You see, because husbands is coming home and families is getting united. Again, husbands hurry on home to see their new babies. Moss always sent a keg of whiskey down to the quarters by old Uncle Silas, the houseman. Old Joe would drink all the kin long the way, but they plentiful all. Sorry if I stumble a little bit. If that done last, old Ma Shelton gonna bring Mo down himself. So here's Mrs. Fanny Berry giving a testimony of her plantation. Before I continue, each plantation had its own culture. Each plantation had its own laws. There was not a uniformity to the way in which the people did things. And so you will have testimonies from one person, and this will be their experience. And somebody goes, it's kind of like work culture. You may not have the same thing if you worked at Walmart than if you worked at Target. You may have a different work culture if you worked at, wherever it is. Just imagine wherever it is, you're going to have a different work culture and tradition. So on her plantation, they would take things, know that they're having a party, and you can see so many things in here. But the husbands, who many times would have been off the plantation, and because there would be different places where they would be employed, their families would be in one space, and they wouldn't see them for months and months at a time. In some instances. So she's saying for these reasons and their conditions that this is what was going on during this time. Drinking, whiskey, the men returning to some degree, and some kind of sweet treat they can expect to have, okay? Bailey Cummings on Christmas. This is another testimony, and that was a female, and he is a male. Okay, so females and males, although they were experiencing quote unquote slavery, they were experiencing it from a different perspective. So that is something to keep in mind. Did you have any holidays? This is the query. We didn't, but one holiday. So Bailey Cummings is like, we didn't have all these different holidays. We had one. That was Christmas Day, and it was not much different from any other day. The field hands did not have to work on Christmas Day. We didn't have any Christmas presents. So comparative to what was her name again? Comparative to what Miss Fanny Berry was saying, he was like, probably, because you have to also keep in mind, depending on the religious affiliation of the quote slave master and his family is going to determine what effects you have. And so if they felt like they were Christians, you may have a different outcome if they were non-Christians or if they were Catholic. You see what I'm saying? You're going to have, if you were the enslaved under that individual, you would have a different story to tell. And Bailey Cummings is like, nothing happened over where we was at. I don't know about y'all, we ain't getting nothing. Miss Julia Frazier says, hold on one second. All right. Miss Julia Frazier says, they had parties on holidays, Easter, Christmas, and Whitsun. I have to look up what Whitsun is. I don't know what that is. On them days, we would play ring plays, jump round and dance. Then nights we danced juba. The girls got new dresses twice a year. Nut old mistress used to give us secondhand clothes. So Julia Frazier is saying, yeah, we know a little something about that. That's when we had some parties, but we was wearing secondhand digs from the mistress. So they were allowed to entertain themselves or enjoy themselves during this time. William I. Johnson Jr. says, in his testimony about Christmas. Christmas is always a get-together time for all slave families on the plantation. So I left Washington for Goochland to visit my mother, sister, and brothers. So once again, we see this, you get a little furlough, you get to come off the plantation, you get a little bit of papers to go visit your family, again, depending on who your, quote, master was. William Wells Brown. To the Christmas holidays, the slaves were greatly indebted for winter recreation, for long custom had given to them the whole week for Christmas Day to the coming in of the new year. On, quote, popular farm, end quote, the hands drew their share of clothing on Christmas Day for the year. So again, we just read another testimony. They got twice a year. It really depends on your peoples, so-called. The clothing for both men and women were made up by women, kept for general sewing and housework. One pair of pants and 2 shirts made the entire stock for a male field hand. The women's garments were manufactured from the same goods that the men received. Many of the men worked at night for themselves, making splint and corn brooms, baskets, shuck mats, and axe handles, which they would sell in the city during Xmas or Christmas week. Each slave was furnished with a pass, something like the following. So William Brown actually gives an example of what the pass would say. Please let my boy, grown men, classified as boys, Jim, pass anywhere in this county until January 1st, 1834. So it's kind of like the ancient driver's license, allows you to drive, it has an expiration date, and oblige respectfully, John Gaines, MD. So this was an example. This was someone's example of what the pass would read, okay? So let's continue. Horace Muse on Christmas says, when I was hired out, they let me come home at Christmas for 3 or 4 days. Then I had to go back to work. It's kind of, again, nothing much has changed, huh? Let's continue. And people still seem to live for this little winter recess or break from their toiling. Jacob Stroyer on Xmas, Christmas, the custom of Christmas. Both masters and slaves regarded Christmas as a great day. When the slaveholder made a large crop, they were pleased and gave the slaves from 5 to 6 days, which was much enjoyed by the Negroes, especially by those who could dance. Christmas morning was held sacred both by master and slave, but in the afternoon or in a part of the next day, the slaves were required to devote themselves to the pleasure of their masters. Some of the masters would buy presents for the slaves, such as hats and tobacco for the men, handkerchiefs, and little things for the women. These things were given after they had been pleased with them, naughty or nice, right? After either dancing or something for their amusement, entertainment. When the slaves came up to their masters and mistress, the latter would welcome them. The men would take off their hats and bow, and the women would make a low curtsy. There would be 2 or 3 large pails filled with sweetened water with a gallon or 2 of whiskey in each. This was dealt out to them until they were partly drunk. While this was going on, those who could talk very well would give tokens of well-wishing to their master and mistress. And some who were born in Africa would sing some of their songs or tell different stories in the customs in Africa. After this, they would spend half a day in dancing in some large cotton house or a scaffold, the master providing fiddlers who came from other plantations if there were none on the place, and who received from $15 to $20 on these occasions. So they had entertainment, person who goes around, strums the fiddle, the DJ, the band, and if you were nice, you would get some trinkets. We'll continue. Another testimony, Levi Pollard. Levi Pollard, or Levi Pollard, says, Christmas time, Mars Charles give us lots of things. Sometimes they would be a little extra, but us always got a peck of flour. He's saying, I'm just going to continue. A whole ham, 5 pounds of real cane sugar, 1 pair of pants, 1 jacket, and 1 pair of shoes. The women get near about the same, I reckon. I ain't never been a good at remembering things I ain't know nothing about. And I ain't never been married. So he was like, I don't really know. I think they got what we got. But since that ain't none of my business, because I ain't never been married, it's either here or there. Another part I found very interesting in his testimony. We're going to continue. Louis Hughes on Christmas. At length, after a long and wearisome journey, we reached Potomac. He's giving a little bit of story because this is actually coming out of a book. McGee home on Christmas Eve. Boss took me into the house and into the sitting room where all the family were assembled and presented me as a Christmas gift. Sorry, I was to the madame, his wife. So people were presented as Christmas gifts. My boss, as I remember him, was tall, raw-boned man, but rather distinguished in looks, with a fine carriage, brilliant in intellect, and considered one of the wealthiest and most successful planters of his time. Mrs. McGee was a handsome, stately woman, about 30 years of age, brunette in complexion, faultless in figure, and imperious in manner. This Louis Hughes continues. I think that they were of Scottish descent. There were 4 children, Emma, Willie, Johnny, and Jimmy. All looked at me, and though I was, quote, a spry little fella, end quote, I was very shy and did not say much, as everything was strange to me. I was put to sleep that night on a pallet on the floor in the dining room, using an old quilt as a covering. The next morning, so they put him to sleep on the floor like one would do their dog. The next morning was so-called Christmas, and it seemed to be accustomed to having eggnog before breakfast. So again, we're talking about customs and traditions that are still present. And you notice that this is when these things would be present during this time of year. Yeah. The process of making this was new and interesting to me. I saw them whip the whites of eggs on a platter to stiff froth. The yolks were thoroughly beaten in a large bowl. Sugar and plenty of good brandy were added, and the whites of the eggs and cream were then stirred in. A little nutmeg grated on top of each glass when filled for serving. And you gotta be careful with that these days, because that sounds like a recipe for salmonella, but I digress. Louis Hughes on Christmas. He continues. This was a delicious drink, and the best of all was there were plenty of it. I served this to all the family, and as there were also visiting relatives present, many glasses were required. And I found the tray so heavy, I could hardly carry it. I helped myself after the service was finished, and I was delighted, for I had never tasted anything so fine before. My boss told me I was to wait on the madame, do any errand necessary, attend to the dining room. In fact, I was installed as general utility boy. It was different from the quieter manner of life I had seen before coming here. It kept my spirits up for some time. I thought of my mother often, but I was gradually growing to the idea that it was useless to cry, and I tried hard to overcome my feelings. What we're seeing here is interesting to note. We are, Malcolm X made it very famous, this thought process between the house Negro and the field Negro. But in the accounts that we've read before concerning the so-called field Negro, the field Negro had the time off because planting wasn't taking place. But Louis Hughes was a house boy, as they would, someone who was like a butler, a servant within the house. So when all of those who were in charge were having these socials and holiday parties, he didn't actually have a break, or they didn't have a break. Mammy didn't have a break. All of the house servants really didn't break because they had to be entertaining or aiding those who were entertaining their guests, and that's something to note. He continues. Sorry. How spent by the slaves. Sorry. About Christmas, my master would give 4 or 5 days holiday to his slaves. And he's saying his slaves like he's outside of that discussion, but we'll continue. During which time he supplied them plentifully with new whiskey, which kept them in a continual state of the most beastly intoxication. He often absolutely forced them to drink more when they had told him they had enough. So he was forcing them to become drunk and revel and get into the quote unquote Christmas spirit. Okay. This is a testimony. We saw another testimony about whiskey being brought, and the person who's bringing it, they may drink a little, but not to worry. There's plenty more where that came from. He often absolutely forced them to drink more when they had told him they had enough. He would then call them together and say, "Now, you slaves, don't you see what bad use you have been making of your liberty?" So it's the ill setup for the okie doke, so that you can say, "Aha, see, you deserve what it is that you get." It's the mind games. Remember, also, we're talking about domestic violence. How does it look, and how it plays out, and how it affects the people long term. Now, this is Frederick Douglass. I believe this is the last one, if I'm not mistaken. Let me see. Let me go back. That was quick. I went quick. Yep, Frederick Douglass. The days between Christmas Day and New Year's Day were allowed the slaves as holidays. During these days, all regular work was suspended, and there was nothing to do but keep fires and looking after the stock. We regard this time as our own by the grace of our masters, and we therefore used it or abused it as we pleased. Those who had families at a distance were expected to visit them and spend with them the entire week. The younger slaves or the unmarried ones were expected to see to the animals and attend to incidental duties at home. The holidays were variously spent, as it is today. He goes on, the sober-thinking industrious ones, meaning entrepreneurs, who weren't drunk, would employ themselves in manufacturing corn brooms, mats, horse collars, and baskets. And some of these were very well made. That's a little bit of shade. He was like some. Another class spent their time in hunting possums, coons, rabbits, and other game, meaning eating food that you wouldn't normally eat because you were usually employed with the slave masters' work and you didn't really benefit from that. So they took time to get them some bush meat. But the majority spent the holidays in sport, playing ball or ball playing, wrestling, boxing, running, foot races, dancing, and drinking whiskey. And this latter mode was generally most agreeable to their masters. This is the second witness, actually the third witness, that's saying that the masters actually encouraged drunkenness. A slave who would work during the holidays was thought by his master undeserving of holidays. There was in his simple act of continued work an accusation against slaves. What, I'm not working you hard enough? And a slave could not help think that if he had made $3 during the holiday, he might make $300 during the year. Not to be drunk during the holidays was disgraceful. Black is white is black, up is down, mental manipulation. We'll continue. Wanting more for yourself besides what has been given you is disgraceful. Frederick Douglass continues. The fiddling, dancing, and, quote, jubilee beating was, end quote, was carried on in all directions. This latter performance was strictly Southern. It supplied the place of a violin or other musical instruments and was played so easily that almost every farm had its juba beater. I call him a DJ, but let's go on. The performer improvised as he beat the instrument, marking the words as he sang so as to have them fall pat with the movement of his hands. Once in a while, among a mass of nonsense and wild frolic, a sharp hit was given to the meanness of slave holders. Take the following, for example. So he's going to give a song now. And I found this song very deep. It says, we raise the wheat, they give us the corn. We bake the bread, they give us the the crust. We shift the meal, they give us the husk. We peel the meat, they give us the skin. And that's the way they take us in. We skim the pot, they give us the liquor, which is just a leftover watery substance, and say that's good enough for a nigger. Walk over your butter and the fat. Poor nigger, you can't get over that. And I know some people may be offended. This is the word that sometimes I substitute words, but this is, for some reason, this is the internalized, as people would say, oppression that was beat into the mentality and the mind of the people, and even in today's time is used just as, like you're saying, brother or something. But again, they're basically saying we're being robbed, and we are aware that we're being robbed. And guess what? when I do have a little time for myself, I'm going to use it productively. And the things that the slave masters were thinking, like, who are you? You know what I'm saying? That it's offensive for you not to take the break that I'm giving you, which I find very interesting, and it plays into the mentality, the abusive environment. Let me say. Frederick Douglass goes on to say, this is not a bad summary of the palpable injustice, meaning the song, and fraud of slavery, giving as it does to the lazy and idle the comforts which God designed should be given solely to the honest laborer. But to the holidays, judging from my own observation and experience, I believe those holidays were among the most effective means in the hands of slaveholders of keeping down the spirit of insurrection among the slaves. To enslaved men, successfully and safely, it is necessary to keep their minds occupied with thoughts and aspirations short of the liberty of which they are deprived. And we know Frederick Douglass made his way, ran off and made his way to freedom, and then became an abolitionist. A certain degree of attainable good must be kept before them. These holidays serve the purpose of keeping the minds of the slaves occupied with prospective pleasure within the limits of slavery. And in this day and time, these holidays create debt slaves because people run up their credit cards, run themselves into debt, you know what I'm saying, that they end up paying off for the rest of the year because they must have these little trinkets, and you must have these things to say that you must have your drunken revelry, which is still present today. But I'll continue. He goes on to say, the young man could go wooing the young man could go wooing the married man to see his wife, the father and mother to see their children. The industrious and money-loving could make a few dollars. The great wrestler could win laurels. The young people meet and enjoy each other's society. The drinking man could get plenty of whiskey, and the religious man could hold prayer meetings, preach, pray, and exhort. Sounds about accurate, and sounds as though nothing must have changed. Before the holidays, there were pleasures in prospect. After the holidays, there were pleasures of memory, and they served to keep out thoughts and wishes of a more dangerous character. These holidays were also used as conductors of safety valves to carry off the explosive elements inseparable from the human mind when reduced to the condition of slavery. Pacify you, essentially. But for these, the rigors of bondage would have become too severe for endurance, and the slave would have been forced to a dangerous desperation. Thus, this is again still Frederick Douglass, they became a part and parcel of the gross wrongs and inhumanity of slavery. Ostensibly, they were institutions of benevolence designed to mitigate the rigors of slave life, but practically they were a fraud instituted by human selfishness, the better to secure the ends of injustice and oppression. Not the slave's happiness, but the master's safety was the end sought. It was not from, because it's like you have to throw a bone in this abusive relationship. Oh, they took me to, they took me to an amusement park. So yeah, they did all these things to me. But look, so it's that little bone in that abusive relationship that you have to throw so that you don't totally lose the person. It was not, so it's that love bomb moment, essentially. It's the setup for the beatdown. You understand? So it's to get you through to the next year. It was not from a generous unconcern for slave labor, but from a prudent regard for the slave system. Because if it was for the concern of the slave labor, then you wouldn't push the person to the degree that you do throughout the year. I am strengthened in this option from the fact that most slaveholders like to have their slaves spend the holidays in such a manner as to be of no real benefit to them. Everything like rational enjoyment was frowned upon, and only those wild and low sports peculiar to semi-civilized people were encouraged. His speech is very interesting. The license allowed appeared to have no other object than to disgust the slaves with their temporary freedom and to make them as glad to return to their work as they had been to leave it. He goes on to say, I saved him for last because he had a lot to say, and we appreciate him for leaving this on record. I have known slaveholders resort to cunning tricks with a view of getting their slaves deplorably drunk. The usual plan was to make bets on slaves that he could drink more whiskey than another, and so induce a rivalry among them for the mastery in this degradation. So drinking contests like shots, right? The scenes brought about in this way were often scandalous and loathsome in the extreme. Whole multitudes might be found stretched out in brutal drunkenness, at once helpless and disgusting. Thus, when the slave asked for hours of, quote, virtuous liberty, end quote, his cunning master took advantage of his ignorance and cheered him with a dose of vicious and revolting dissipation, artfully labeled with the name of liberty. Fredrick goes on to say, we were induced to drink. I among the rest, and when the holidays were over, we all staggered up from our filth and wallowing, took a long breath, and went away to our various fields of work, feeling upon the whole rather glad to go from that which our master had artfully deceived us into belief was freedom, back again to the arms of slavery. It was not what we had taken it to be, nor what it would have been had it not been abused by us. It was about as well to be a slave to the master as to be a slave to whiskey and rum. When a slave was drunk, the slaveholder had no fear that he would plan an insurrection or that he would escape to the north. It was the sober, thoughtful slave who was dangerous and needed the vigilance of his master to keep him a slave. And that is the end thereof of this discussion. Well, not necessarily the end, because you can definitely share, but that was the end of the part that I had prepared, taking a look at, what's this? I think it's 10 or 11 testimonies of those who were there, eyewitnesses who can tell you. And then it's for us to look back at that, like Frederick Douglass in his speech was very aware of what was going on. And what is wild is that when we look back in history and look at our foreparents and feel as though we know way more than they did when they were actually knee deep in it, and what it was more real to them. And today we have kind of, to a certain degree, forgotten the things that they did know and were very aware of. And so if we look back at what he shared, and all of them shared, and really assess what it is we are taking part in, what it is that we're buying into, to see whether or not we have elevated any, or whether or not we're still complying with the very same things, still buying into the concept of these holidays to, again, get you drunken, get you in debt, get you looking to go back to work so that you can crawl your way out of debt because, this is what you did last year, and now this year you start off January 1 in debt. This is kind of how it happens. So with that said, I want to thank everybody for tuning in. I had to do this one a little early today. Feel free to check us on the replay. Let us know your thoughts. And yeah, put your comments below, subscribe, share, all that nice good stuff. All right? 1.